Hello and welcome to another off-the-shelf board game review. This is a series of videos where I'll take a board game, teach it to you, show you some sample gameplay, and then give you my final thoughts of the game overall. In this video, I'm going to show you how to play Archipelago. Archipelago is a civilization-style game, but it's more of a hybrid game because it does have mechanics of negotiation, exploration, and also area control and economics. The designer of the game is Christoph Bollinger, who may be familiar to you because he also designed Dungeon Twister Prison, which is one of my favorite top 10 two-player games out there, and also the designer of Earth Reborn. Archipelago does play from 2 to 5 players. There are currently 2 expansions out for it right now. The first expansion actually adds solo play. I have no experience with it, so if you do, and you feel free to, leave some comments in the YouTube comments if you have some experience with the solo expansion. The second expansion I do have a little bit of experience with, and if you like Archipelago, I can definitely recommend it because it does add a little more conflict to the game. In Archipelago, each player is a European explorer in the Age of Discovery. What makes Archipelago unique compared to literally hundreds of games about the Age of Discovery and about exploration is the fact that while Archipelago has open scoring conditions that all the players are working towards, the game also has hidden scoring mechanics that everybody is working towards, but only you know what your hidden scoring mechanic is. But you have to be careful about not telegraphing exactly what you're going after because the other players can also score off of your hidden mechanics if you telegraph too much and they figure out exactly what you're trying to do to score your points. Not only are the other players trying to figure out what you're trying to do to score points, they're also trying to figure out exactly what your end game condition is, because not only do these cards give you victory points, they also dictate what is the end game condition. And as soon as the end game condition has been met, doesn't matter who met the end game condition, as soon as that happens, that's the last round of the game and the game is over. Scores are tallied up and the player is the person with the most medals, because the medals are the victory points in the game. Players will be interacting and dealing with an import market and an export market, dealing with crises that appear throughout the game, and also adding different powers to their available actions, such as the ability to steal items from other players, the ability to interact with the board, and also various ways to score extra points, such as building wonders. Of course, no game about exploration would be completed without exploration, gathering resources, and of course the biggest trick of all is trying to keep the people that you're exploiting from rebelling. Of course, this game is a competitive game where all the players were against each other, but you're also playing against the board in Archipelago, because in Archipelago, if the natives get too restless, they're going to rebel and all the players lose. Of course, that means nothing if one of the players is a separatist. If one of the players is a separatist, they actually want the rebellion, because if there's a rebellion and you're the separatist, you're the winner, the only winner, and all the other players lose. Can you most efficiently discover, exploit, and explore these islands? That is the game of Archipelago. Before I show you exactly how to play Archipelago, there's a few concepts you really need to understand. The first and probably the biggest Achilles heel for the game is the fact that there is a lot of replay value in the game. And what I mean by that is there's lots of variability to the game, which can cause the game to play differently every single time you play it. And sometimes the cards may be in your favor. Actually, I should say most of the time the cards are going to be in your favor, but once in a great while you're going to get a pretty bad card mix that's not going to match with your player count. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm going to comment in this about my review, but just understand there's a lot of variety to this game. And I'm going to explain some of that variety really quick before I teach you how to play the game. The first and most important thing to understand about Archipelago is that there's actually 3 different game links that come with the game, and that's dictated by these 3 different decks of 10 cards. You're never ever going to use all 3 of these decks in one game. Don't shuffle them up, don't mix them up, don't do anything like that, because you're going to completely break the game. What you need to do is you need to decide if you want the extremely long 4-hour game with 5 players, if you want the semi-long 2.5 to 3-hour game with 5 players, or if you want the more better for your playtime, if this is the amount of playtime you have available, your 1.5 to 2-hour game with 5 players deck. And trust me when I say this is not a gimmick. These 3 decks are going to make a huge difference in the amount of playtime this game is going to take. I enjoy playing the long game, I really do, but I will not play it with 5 players because it can literally take multiple hours. And it's not because the game is bad. I think the game is good. Not trying to get ahead of myself again here. But I think the game plays just as fantastic using the medium length deck and the short length deck, so I like to get as much gameplay as I can in with my gameplay time. So I personally recommend playing with the medium sized deck, or if you're really in a hurry, playing with a short time deck. But again, don't think that means the long deck makes for a bad game. It just takes a long, long time. Now, the other really important thing to understand about Archipelago is that the game is meant to be played out of the box for the game. This isn't a game where you're going to dump the entire context out of the box, sort them across the table, and try to get your game started. You literally play the game out of the box, quite literally, and it's been molded and made for you to play out of the box itself. Everything has been specifically molded, so you have exactly stacks of 8 Explorer tokens. These core cards are going to be placed in the box exactly like this, so you can't see the back halves of them, and for the matter of fact that you're never supposed to see what the next card is in line. So the game is specifically designed to be played out of the box. It's a fantastic gameplay design, but it's something you need to understand as you do play the game out of the box. And I preface this because my camera lens is not going to be able to include everything, so this box is going to be off the screen. Another really important thing to understand about Archipelago is that all the resources in this game, and I mean literally all the resources in the game, are limited. And there's a specific reason why all the resources in this game are limited. A lot of these resources are victory and endgame conditions. A lot of the endgame conditions will say once X amount of resources are on the board or X amount of buildings are on the board, the game is going to either immediately come to an end or it's going to come to an end at the end of that player's turn. So very specifically, there's an exact amount of resources that comes with the game. If you ever run out of green cubes, you're not going to run out and grab some Pente stones and replace them because that is the absolute limit for the game. Green represents vegetables, black represents iron. Those are the absolute limits. It also goes for the bank. It also goes for the amount of workers players get. All the players get exactly 10 workers. And also players get a maximum of 5 action discs that they can use. You use all 5 of them, you're not going to find another way to get extra action discs. You're limited by the resources that come in the game. The game board for Archipelago is also going to be built as the players play the game through explore actions. And the very important thing to understand about these tiles is that they're all double-sided. There is a starting tile that's always going to be used as a starting tile whenever you play the game. And it's one that has the giant whales on it and the 5 fishing symbols. You're always going to start with this as a basic tile, unless you want to use one of the variants that comes with the game. And then you're going to build the game board as you go. Now the trick here is, and this is very, very important, as you're building the game board, you are required to build the game board logically. You cannot build in such a way that would cause an illogical type of situation be created by the game board. And specifically that means that all the coasts need to line up, mountains need to line up with each other, and everything has to line up every time you add tiles to the board. So for example, while you may think that this may be a completely legal building of the game board, it's actually completely illegal because you're going to see that this mountain range connects to grasslands, which is completely illegal, so I could never play this tile exactly like this. I couldn't play it like this either because, again, mountains are touching grassland. But I could play this tile exactly like this because we have mountains touching mountains, grassland touching grassland, and even though I have mountains over here, they're not touching directly to another hex tile. And I can continue to build and build as long as I continue to respect the rules of the game board. Again, that would be a completely illegal building on the game board because I have grasslands touching water, which is not legal. Even though I have mountains touching mountains, that would be legal. Whereas opposed if I were to flip the tile over like this, again, we're looking at illegal because we have mountains touching water. Every time you build or add a tile to the game board, it has to match up. If you don't, it's an illegal placement of the tile and you cannot play the tile in that respect. Archipelago also comes with multiple game boards that are going to be played as you're playing the game. Now again, you have your secret scoring conditions that you're going to pick out every time you play the game, and I'll get into those in a minute. I just want to go over a couple overview points, but every time you play, you're going to have 4 boards that are always going to be in the game. You have your domestic board, which is the orange board, and if you forget, there's a symbol of a marketplace over here in the corner. You have your export board, and if you forget, there's a picture of a port, so remind you that you export through a port. Again, it's the 1500s, the age of discovery. So again, we don't have fancy airplanes, we have to do everything by boat. So this is your export board. This board over here is your citizen and your rebellion track. It's used for both. The white meeple is going to represent how many citizens there are on the game board, and the amount of citizens is based on how many meeples the players have total. So if each player has 3 meeples and you're playing a 5-player game, that means you have 15 citizens. The white meeple is always going to equal exactly how many meeples total the players have currently on the game board. If one player has 5 meeples and you're playing a 2-player game and the other player only has 2 meeples, that is a total of 7 citizens in the game, and this track is going to match that. The black meeple represents the rebellion. The rebellion is kind of an abstract thing, and it's just going to be a track that's going to be constantly tracked. The rebellion level is going to go up as the game plays. If the rebellion level ever at any time surpasses the amount of citizens in the archipelago, that means your citizens, your people of Europe, have been outnumbered by the rebellion. The separatists now outnumber you, and everybody has lost the game. Unless, of course, one of the players has the hidden scoring card for the separatists, and if one player does have the separatist card, that player alone is the winner of the game, and all the other players lose. It doesn't matter what their scores are. If one player is a separatist and you manage to put everything in a rebellion, that player alone has won the game. So this is an interesting game where the players are playing against each other, and definitely always playing against each other because there's only one winner. But in a way, the game's also a semi-cooperative because the players are working together to make sure that there is never a rebellion. Of course, unless you happen to be a separatist, then you want the rebellion so you can win the game. Finally, there's also a surplus worker board, and this is going to be tracked by the gray meeple. Now, the gray meeple represents the amount of workers that the players can hire. Every time you hire a worker to add to your workforce through the citizens, you're going to add to your workforce. Every time you hire one of those meeples to add to your workforce, the amount of people that you can hire from on this board that's tracked right here is going to continue to go down. If this board or track is ever at 0, that means there are no citizens available to hire. Even if you happen to have meeples that you can still add to the board, you can't do it because there's nobody to hire unless you take a special action on the action board. Archipelago is played over phases. The first 4 phases of the game is pretty much players are going to be going back and forth doing various things and trying to survive crises and things that are going to make life more difficult for them. But the 5th phase is where the players get the most interaction with the board because they're going to deal with the action board itself. This is where the players are going to play their action discs to take various actions across the game board to interact with each other, interact with the board, and manage to score points or work towards their victory goals to win the game. The game is played over turns, but the 5th phase, which is the action phase, is actually played over turns. And if you ever played games like Terra Mystica, this is actually make pretty darn good sense to you. Basically, what's going to happen is on your turn during the 5th phase, you're going to get the opportunity to play 1 action disc on the action board. Once you've played your 1 action disc, and there's other things you can do, but I want to get ahead of myself here. After you played your 1 action disc and interact with the action board, the next player in line is going to get to take an action and play an action on the action board, and this is going to continue going around until all players have managed to put all their action discs on the board and have no other actions available to them that they can play on their turn. Once all the players have used up all their action discs and all their potential additional actions, the 5th phase is over, and then you move on to the 6th phase where you have the ability to purchase evolution cards to change everything up and increase your powers and abilities throughout the game. There's just a few more core concepts I need to explain to you before I actually show you how to play Archipelago. And again, it's very important to understand these core concepts because if you're confused with these, the rest of the game is really not going to make much sense to you. The other thing I really need to show you about Archipelago is that the game, as I said, is going to be played on these hex tiles. These hex tiles are referred to as region tiles. And every one of these region tiles is going to have a whole bunch of symbols on them. And it's very important about these symbols because every one of these tiles is going to have a total of either 5 symbols, which is going to be broken down into various resources such as fish, wood, stone, or the very hard thing that some people kind of make a mistake on are these going to be these little huts that are on each one of these region tiles. Now, every time, if you're ever looking for these huts because they like to blend in on these tiles, and the first couple times you're playing the game, you're definitely going to be hunting around these tiles to figure out where these huts are. A little trick I like to tell new players when they're learning the game is that the total amount of huts plus these resource spaces that you're going to see is always going to equal 5 for every single one of these tiles, front and back, except for the volcano tile. The volcano tile is the only tile out of these 25 tiles that is not going to add up to a total of 5 resources. And the volcano tile itself actually has 0 resources present on it, just has 3 huts on it. And now that's very important to understand because the amount of huts that are going to appear on these region tiles is going to affect how many people you have available to hire across the archipelago. Every time you add one of these tiles to the archipelago as you're building the archipelago up, and there's actually the volcano tile, but as you're building up the archipelago, every time you reveal another one of these tiles, this track right here is going to go up for every single hut that appears on the new tile that you reveal. So if you flip over a tile that only has one hut on it, the amount of hirelings available to be hired is going to go up by 1. If you happen to flip over a tile like this that happens to have 3 huts on it and you add it to the board, you're actually going to raise the hireling track up by 3. It's a very important concept and it's very easy to miss, so I just make sure that I explain it to you. These little huts are hidden. There can be anywhere from 1 to 3 huts, and they're going to adjust how much this track goes up every time one of these region tiles are added to the board. While we're on the topic of these region tiles, again, they're all double-sided, and the sides are always going to be different from each other. You can never have more than 3 of your workers on a region tile at the end of one of your actions. And I say at the end of your actions because you actually do a migrate action where you can move more than 3 of your workers through one tile total, but at the end of your migrate action, and migrate is just a way to say your movement action. It's called migrating in the game, but it's basically just your movement action. At the end of your migrate action, you can never have more than 3 meeples of your color on a region tile. Another player can have 3, another player can have 3. So in a 5-player game, you could technically have 15 meeples on one of these tiles being very crowded. But again, you can never have more than 3 meeples of your color per region tile. Also, it's very important to know that whenever you move a meeple onto a new region tile, make sure that you never set a meeple on top of one of these resources. You never move a meeple onto one of these resources until they're actually gathering that resource from that region tile itself. And once you move them onto that resource, they're actually engaged with that resource, and they're actually stuck on that resource till the end of the round, and you move to the beginning of the new round, which is the reset part of the phase. And finally, the other most important thing to understand about these region tiles is don't get lazy and lay your meeples down. Because when a meeple is laying down, it does mean something in the game of Archipelago. So you want to make sure that you're not being lazy, toss your meeples around. Because anytime a meeple is laying down, that means that meeple, and that meeple only, is actually in rebellion. So when you're moving your meeples around, make sure you keep them standing up. Of course, unless they are in rebellion. If they are in rebellion, make sure you lay them down. That's enough of the basics now. The real question is, how do you win the game of Archipelago? The game of Archipelago is a points-based game. Players are working on trying to get the most points at the end of the game. Whereas the most points is going to be the winner. Of course, that means that only happens if the rebellion doesn't happen. Because if the rebellion happens, again, everybody loses unless you happen to be the separatist. There can only be one separatist per game, and the separatist isn't always in every single game. And the reason why that is because every time you play the game of Archipelago, every single player is going to get one of these secret condition cards, one card only, and it's going to do 2 things. One, it's going to tell them exactly what conditions can bring the end of the game, and it's also going to tell them exactly what this player needs to do to score victory points at the end of the game. Now, the interesting thing about Archipelago is that every single player is going to get one of these cards, and these endgame conditions are going to go for all players. So the trick is that you may not know exactly what the endgame condition happens to be for all the players, and you may accidentally trigger the end game just by making a decision and not realizing you just brought about the end game. Again, every single player is going to get one of these cards. So in a 5-player game, you're going to have 5 of these cards. And these cards are going to be hidden behind your screen so no other player can see exactly what your end game conditions are and what your victory conditions are. But the funnest part about Archipelago is that if anybody achieves that end game condition, it's going to end the game for all the players. And when you add up all the scores at the end of the game, everybody is going to compare how well they did on this victory point condition. And even if this happens to be your card and somebody happened to do better on this requirement, they're going to get the points, and you may not get any points, some points, or a combination of anything in between. So the fun thing about Archipelago is you got to be watching what the other players are doing and trying to figure out exactly what they're trying to do to score the victory points, because those victory points are available to you also if you can outperform them in whatever their requirement just happens to be. So for example, let's just say the green player happens to have this victory condition card in their hand. Again, it's going to be hidden behind their shield so no other player can see exactly what this player's victory conditions are. Or if you don't have the card, you can obviously flip it over as long as you remember what your end-game conditions are. You always have to be making sure you're monitoring the end-game condition because, again, as soon as this end-game condition happens, that will be the last turn for all the players, and actually all the other players aren't even going to get a turn. As soon as this condition happens, whoever caused this condition to happen is going to finish out their turn, and that is going to end the game. And it's going to be based always on the amount of players. So for example, this card right here says that In a two-player game, as soon as the third town is built, whoever built that third town is going to finish out their turn. That is going to be the end of the game. This card right here says in a two-player game, as soon as the 15th citizen is hired on the archipelago and added to the archipelago, that's going to trigger the final turn of the game. This card over here, for example, says that as soon as 2 resources have been depleted from the bank, whether those resources happen to be on the resource board, whether those resources happen to be on the export board, or if those resources happen to be in possession of one of the players, as soon as 2 of these banks are completely empty, that's going to trigger the end of the game. Or if you have a card such as this one says that in a two-player game, as soon as the 4th progress card is purchased, it's going to cause the end of the game. Now, the way you tell the difference between a progress card and the way you tell the difference between a person card is usually they're going to be pretty darn obvious to be a way to tell the difference. But if you have trouble telling the difference, each one of these cards are going to be numbered in the lower left-hand corner, and it's very small, but it's color coordinated. All progress cards are numbered in white. All person cards or people that you can hire are going to be in black. So if it's a white number in the lower left-hand corner, it is a progress card. And again, if it's black in the lower half of the card, it's going to be a person card. These small square cards are actually referred to as evolution cards, but again, they are broken down into 2 types. You have your person evolution cards, and then you have your progress evolution cards. Again, there are 2 different types, and they can judge the ending conditions. So again, for example, with this ending condition right here, in a 4-player game, it says as soon as a 6th progress card is purchased by any player, it doesn't matter who purchases the 6th, one person can have 4 progress cards, and as soon as one other player buys the 6th progress card, it is going to bring about the end of the game. Of course, this also means you can buy 20 person cards. It doesn't matter. It's not going to bring about the end game because this end game card specifically says progress cards only. Now, once any one of the end game conditions are going to be triggered, all the players are going to add up all their victory points based on the various conditions that are going to give victory points. Every one of these cards is going to give a certain amount of victory points based on who did the most of whatever the requirement happens to be. For example, this card here says that whoever owns the most ports in the game, and this has to be controlled ports. It doesn't mean a port built on the game. And I'll get into control and not controlled in just a few moments here, but the important thing is to understand whoever controls the most ports is going to get 3 victory points. Whoever has the second most controlled victory points or controlled ports is going to get 2 victory points. And whoever has the third most controlled ports is going to get 1 victory point. Now, if you happen to have 0 controlled ports, you're not going to get any victory points at all. You have to have at least 1 controlled port. And if you have at least 1 controlled port, you're going to get possible amount of victory points depending on how you did versus the other players. I'll bypass this card just for a moment because it's the pacifist card, which is a little bit different. Another example of a card right here is one for the marketplaces. This one says if you have the most controlled marketplaces at the end of the game, you're going to get 3 victory points, all the way down to 1 or 0 victory points if you control 0 marketplaces. Then you have one such as this that says for every church you control, if you control the most churches, obviously 3 victory points. Least churches, 1 victory point. No churches, 0 victory points. So the next question you may be asking is exactly how do you control a church? How do you control a marketplace? How do you control a port? Well, the way you control these locations is you have to have a meeple on top of that location when the end game happens. If you happen to have one of your meeples on top of one of these locations, for example, this church, if you have a meeple on top of it and your meeple is not in rebellion, because if you're in rebellion, you don't control anything, because any meeple who is in rebellion is a lazy person who isn't going to do anything for your empire you're trying to build here. So to control any location, you have to have a meeple standing up in that location. And if you happen to have a meeple standing on that location, you happen to control that location. The one caveat to that, though, is if you happen to control the town for that region tile, if you have your meeple on top of that town, you happen to control every single building on that region tile that is not currently occupied by one of your opponents. So if you have a marketplace, you happen to have a church, and you also happen to have a port. And if none of these locations are occupied by one of your opponent's meeples, and if you have one of your meeples on top of the town, you control all four of these locations, even though you only have one meeple on the town. But it doesn't work in reverse. If you happen to have your meeple on top of the church, and you don't have one of your meeples on the town, you only control the church at the end of the game, and you're only going to score victory points for controlling that church. Again, if you have your meeple on top of the town, you control all these buildings on this region tile only, and you can score the victory points for having those. So this one meeple right here, if these were ending conditions right here for the church and for the port, the fact that this meeple happens to be on top of a town, he's going to score you one controlled church, one controlled port, and that can score you victory points towards the victory condition for the game. Of course, the downfall to that is if you happen to have a region tile with no meeples on any one of these buildings, that means none of these buildings are controlled. That means none of these buildings are going to work towards the victory conditions, which means all those buildings are a complete waste because nobody's going to score any points off any of those buildings. As I said already, Archipelago is billed as a semi-cooperative game. And again, I don't think it's a really good description for the game because while the game can actually beat all the players, again, in reality, all the players are definitely playing against each other. And this game also allows for a lot of very cutthroat, very competitive negotiation. Think almost Game of Thrones, the board game, light. In Archipelago, negotiating and treachery are not only common, but actually encouraged. Promises are only as binding as you want them to be, and revenge, as always, is a dish best served cold. There are a few limitations to negotiations, though, and this is why I call it Game of Thrones light. There's only 3 times during the game you can do negotiations. The first time you do negotiations is when you're negotiating for player order after players have decided to make their bid for player order. And I'll get into that in just a moment when I actually break down the phases of the game. The second time you can do negotiation is anytime somebody's working during the action phase, which is the 5th phase of the game. And the action phase is the phase of the game that deals entirely with this board, which is called the action selection board. And finally, the other time you can deal with negotiations is anytime you're trying to settle a crisis card. And a crisis card is any one of these cards, which is the back half of the evolution cards. On the back of all these cards, there are crisis cards. On the front of all these crisis cards is where you get the character cards and also where you get the progress cards. So these cards are double use, and again, as I said earlier, that's why all these cards need to stay in the box so that way you don't have any idea what card is coming up next. It's always supposed to be surprised exactly what's coming next when you're dealing with the evolution cards and also when you're dealing with the region hex tiles that you're going to be putting out to create the game board. Now, back on the topic of negotiation, in this game, when you're negotiating, every single thing when it comes to negotiation is 100% fair game. There's only 2 things you can never, ever negotiate in this game. The first thing is you can never negotiate your action discs with another player. The other thing you can never do is you can never negotiate your units. Now, units in this game is your citizens, and units in this game happen to be your ships. Everything else when it comes to negotiations is fair game, including evolution cards. And actually, it also should go without saying, though, that your victory condition cards are always secret. You can never negotiate these. Make an example of, if you pay me 15, I'll show you exactly what my victory condition card is. These cards are always secret. You can never, ever reveal what your secret victory condition card is to any other player ever during a game. Every game of Archipelago is going to start with a turn 0, and basically it's a fancy way of saying the setup of the game. The reason why it's called turn 0 is it actually allows you to set up the game and adds the randomness, allows all the players to make some decisions about how exactly a game of Archipelago is exactly going to start, and adds some variety and makes sure the game is never exactly the same every time you play it. When you set up the game for Archipelago for the turn 0, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to set up the domestic board. Now, the domestic board is going to get 1 resource of every type, and these resources are going to fill up from a left to right, top to bottom always. And that's going to be the way you have to set up resources on these boards every time. Every time you add extra resources, it's going to be left to right, top to bottom. And the reason why is as these resource boards get filled up, it's going to affect the amount of rebel potential, the amount of possible natives that you can hire for your crews and your citizens, And it's also going to affect the way these boards work out. But again, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. The important thing is make sure you always fill these boards left to right, top to bottom, whenever you add or remove resources on either the domestic board or the export board itself. Each player is also going to start with a certain amount of resources, and if you forget it, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. You start off with 1 ship, you start off with 2 meeples, and you start off with 3 resource discs. 1, 2, 3, easy way to remember. Additionally, each player is going to start with 10 money, and the silver money represents 1s, the gold money represents 5s. So that's 10 money for each player. Now, money, the amount of money you have is constantly hid behind your screen so no other player knows exactly how much money you have. And any resources you get from either any of these boards or from the bank are also always hidden behind your screen. So again, no player knows exactly how many resources you happen to possess at any time. The game box is also going to have to be set up every time before you play. And it's easy because it's generally the way you're going to store it. You're going to have your resources out. Every one of these Explorer token stacks has to be counted exactly to 8. So you have 8 in every single stack. And you also have to remember every time you grab one of these Explorer tokens, you take from the outside of the box working in. And the reason why you have to do this is because every time one of these stacks of Explorer tokens is completely used up, you permanently get an extra action disc you get to add, and every single player gets to get that extra action disc. And as soon as the second stack of Explorer tokens is removed, every player is going to get their final action disc for a total of 5. When the third stack of Explorer tokens is removed, nothing happens, but that's actually one of the endgame conditions, especially if that happens to be one of the endgame conditions that's been drawn by one of the players. So, while nothing could possibly happen when the third stack is drawn, it's also possible when you remove that third stack, finally, the game could come to an end. The deck of evolution cards is also going to be shuffled up and randomized, and it's going to be placed inside the box exactly like this. You want to make sure you face it for convenience, so whoever's controlling the market boards is also the person who has this facing towards them so they can see this at all times. It's going to make it much simpler to handle the crisis cards when they come out. Once all the players have their starting resources, you're basically ready to begin the game. And you're going to start with the very first 0 turn for the game and allow every player to start getting their resources and start developing the game board and starting to play. First thing you need to do is you need to put a ship out on the starting hex for all the players, making sure you don't cover any one of the resources on the starting hex. Remember, if you're covering a resource, you're actually interacting with it, and you can only do that by doing an action. So again, make sure none of the starting ships are on any one of these resources that can be harvested. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to randomly choose player order for turn 0. You can do it any way you like. Once you've decided which exactly player is going to go ahead and act first, every one of the players is going to get 3 hex tiles that they're going to get to start with. Every player is going to take these 3 hex tiles. They're going to pick one of these hex tiles they're going to play, and the other 2 are going to be discarded. And then in player order, those players are going to place the hex tile down in a legal position. Since blue is going to be the first player, they're going to get to go first. They're going to place their hex tile down. They're going to place it again in a legal position. They're going to move their ship onto that hex tile, and they're going to land their 2 citizens on that hex tile, and that's going to be their starting position. Every time a brand new hex tile is added to the game board, a couple different things have to happen in a certain order. Obviously, first, the hex tile needs to be added to the board in a legal position. Once the hex tile has been added to the board in a legal position, you need to do a couple of things. First, the person who discovered that tile is going to get an Explorer token. Now, these Explorer tokens have 2 uses. One, they can actually be a victory condition, and the second thing is these can also be discarded as a wild card resource during the game if you ever need to spend a resource. You're basically going to turn it in for the resource you want and then spend that resource any way you can, but they can only be used at certain times. Again, every time you explore a new tile, you're going to get an Explorer token, and if you happen to empty that stack of Explorer tokens, again, every single player is going to get another action disc. After you've gotten your Explorer token, the next thing you need to do is the market board is going to get 1 resource, depending on any resources that are displayed on the board. Plus, if there's any extra resources, the player discover that tile gets the potential to possibly also get some free resources for themselves. Now, the best way to understand this mechanic is just to do a visual representation. Now, you don't have to actually put the resource cubes down on the hex tile, but it's going to help you understand exactly what happens every time you explore a new hex tile. Every time you explore a new hex tile, what you need to do after you have your explorer token is you need to pick one of these resources, and it's going to get added to the domestic market board. Again, remember, make sure you're adding it to the domestic market board, not the export board is going to add to the domestic market board. You pick any one of those resources first, and you add it to the domestic market board. If there are any resources left on this tile, in this example, there happens to be one resource left, you get to pick one and only one of the remaining resources. Now, that was pretty easy to show you with this tile here because there's only 2 resources on it. But if you happen to have a tile such as this one, which happens to have 4 resources on it, you happen to have 2 wood on it, and you also happen to have 2 fish on it, it allows you to get a little more variety and a little more leeway on exactly which ones you can choose. So in this example, this happened to be the tile that this player decided to play. And again, we should play it in a way that's a legal positioning. We would get our explorer token. Every time we explore a new tile, we always get an explorer token. Then we're going to pick one of these resources and we're going to add it to the domestic market board. Again, the player who discovered gets the option of picking whatever resource they want to do. So we could add the fish to the domestic market board, and then we get to pick one of these remaining resources, and we get to keep it behind our board, and the remaining resources are going to be discarded. Now, when you're playing the game, you don't have to add the resources to the market or to the region tile. I just did that to help you understand exactly how that works. After you've dealt with the resources the tile produces, what you need to do is you need to look at the tile and count how many huts are on the region tile. Now remember, the amount of huts is going to be based on however many resources are displayed on that tile. This tile, for example, has 4 resources on it, so we know there's going to be 1 hut on it, whereas opposed to that tile we had a moment ago with the 2 wood, we know there's going to be 3 huts on it, and those huts are located right here grouped up together. The amount of huts that are on the tile that got added to the board are going to add to this track right here, which shows how many people are available to hire throughout the game. At the beginning of the game, this track always starts at 0, and it shows how many people, again, are available to be hired. And since we revealed a tile with 1 hut on it, we're going to add 1 to the amount of people available to be hired by the players by doing a hiring action during Phase 5. Don't want to get ahead of myself here. But just to show you an example, if we had decided to actually take this tile instead, the one with the 3 huts, we would have actually added 3 to our track right here, which would have put us at a total of 3 on the hireling track. The trick is that you have to be very careful with the surplus worker track, because as the surplus worker track starts filling up, you're going to start noticing that you're going to start getting rebels, which is going to raise the rebel track. And again, if the rebel track ever passes the amount of citizens that you have on your archipelago, remember, all the players are going to lose instantly. After the first player has their opportunity to make sure they pick whichever tile they want to add, they get the opportunity to get the explorer token, they get the opportunity to get their free resources, and they move up the surplus worker board. The next player in line gets the opportunity to do the exact same thing. They're going to pick a tile they want to add to the archipelago. They're going to place it in a legal position on the archipelago. They're going to sail their ship over there. They're going to drop off their 2 citizens onto the map. They're going to get an explorer token just like the first player did. They're going to choose a resource, which is going to go onto the the domestic board. They're going to take a resource for themselves. They're going to count up the amount of huts that happen to be on the new tile that got added. They're going to raise up the surplus worker board. And now our board is set up for the start of the game. All we need to do is just count up the amount of citizens that are currently in the game. And that's where our citizens track is going to start. Since every player starts with 2 citizens, it's basically going to be the amount of players times 2. So we have a 2-player game. So our citizen track is going to start with 4. If we happen to be having a 5-player game, after we had all these tiles set up, we should have a total of 10 citizens on the board, and the citizen track would be put at 10. Again, since we have a 2-player game, there's only 4 citizens, and we got to make sure the citizen track always stays ahead of the rebel track. Again, if the rebel track passes the citizens, all players lose. Once all the players have finished their first exploration, you're going to shuffle up all the unused tiles. You're going to take all these tiles, you're going to add it to the pile here for the exploration tokens. And once they're in here, the players are no longer allowed to look at any exploration tokens below. The only one they can ever see is the top one. That's the only exploration token they'll ever know for the region tile. The only region tile they ever get to look at is the top one. Players are never allowed to go through the stack and look at the order of the region tiles as they're coming up. Next thing players are going to do is they're going to fill up the evolution track, which is going to be the evolution cards that are available for the players to purchase during the 6th phase. Again, the game is played over phases, so I want to show you this in order, but we're still in turn 0 and still setting up the game. This is the evolution track, and again, these cards are going to be able to be purchased by the players during the 6th phase of the game. There's only 2 things left to do, then the players can actually start moving towards the actual full game and start turn number 1. First thing you need to do is you need to shuffle up the deck of trend cards, take the top trend card off the deck, and then the rest of the trend cards are not going to be used for the rest of the game. What the trend card is a victory condition that's open for all players to see and for all players to work towards on top of their secret victory and secret endgame and secret victory point condition cards. This trend card is going to be available and open to all players, and basically it's going to give victory points for whoever does the best on the trend. For example, this trend card says whoever controls the most churches at the end of the game is going to get 4 victory points, and unlike the secret victory condition cards, which are worth 3, 2, and 1 victory points, the trend cards are all worth 4, 3, and 2 victory points depending on how well you do. Whoever has the most churches is going to get 4 victory points, second place gets 3, third place gets 2, and remember, if you have 0 churches, you're going to get 0 victory points, even if you would have gotten second or third place for 0 churches. You have to have at least 1 church, and then whoever has the most is going to get those victory points at the end of the game. After that, you need to decide if you want to have a short, medium, or long game. For the tutorial, I'm just going to show you the short game. Every single player is going to secretly get 1 secret victory condition card, and they're not going to reveal it to the other player. It's going to be put behind their screen, and that's going to judge exactly what they're going to do for victory points. It's also going to judge exactly how the game is going to end. We're now ready to start turn 1 of Archipelago. The first thing you will need to do during the turn is you get phase 1. Now during the first turn of the game, phase 1 is actually skipped, and the reason why is because phase 1 is basically just a refresh phase. During phase 1, if you happen to have any one of your units who happens to be in a rebellion state, which means they're laying down, they're going to be stood back up. If you happen to have any units who happen to be gathering resources on the prior turn, they're going to be moved off those resources so they'll be used again. And if you happen to have any evolution cards that you happen to use on your prior turn, which required you to turn them 90 degrees to use them because they're 1 use only per round, or I'm sorry, per turn, those cards will also refresh so they can be used again during this turn. Phase 2 is the turn where, or the phase where players get the opportunity to decide player order. Now the way this is going to work is it's going to be a bid system, and there's going to be a lot of negotiation. Basically, every single player is going to decide how much money they want to put in and bid to see about player turn order. Basically, all the players are going to put a certain amount of money in their hand, and they're going to put a closed fist in the center of the table. Once everybody's got a certain amount of money, and you can bet anywhere from 0 to as much money as you happen to have, all players are going to reveal exactly how much money they happen to bid. And it doesn't matter how much you bid or whether you win or lose the bid, this money is gone and returned to the bank after the bidding is over. The player who bid the most money, and remember it's the most money, if you happen to tie, there's a different rule for that, but whoever bid the most money gets to decide the player order for that turn. And it's not whoever bid the most money is going to go first. They actually get to decide who is going to go in what order. And the reason why this is interesting is this is where you can start negotiating. Let's say, for example, blue decided to bid $2 and red only bid $1. Blue would decide that he gets to decide the player order, but red decides to say, well, you know what? I'll pay you 5 gold if you let me go first. Blue says, hey, that's a good idea. I'll let you do that. So red gets to go first and blue gets to go second. So this is one of those times where a lot of heavy negotiation can start in the game, and it's just the start of potential negotiation in the game. Now remember, when you negotiate, everything except those 3 things I mentioned are fair game. So you can say, I'll pay you food, I'll pay you resources, I'll pay you anything to make their player order go in this turn order. This can get a lot of fun, especially in a 5-player game where you can do stuff like, if you make me second, I'll give you 5 gold. And as a matter of fact, if you make this player over here go last, I'll give you 10 gold, or anything along those lines. That's where the cool negotiation comes in when you're trying to judge player order. After the player order bids are finished, you move on to phase 3, and phase 3 is where you're going to handle exactly adjusting the population tracks based on the 1, 2, 3, and the 4 board. Now basically what these boards are going to do is they're going to adjust the amount of surplus workers. They're also going to end up possibly adjusting how much the rebellion track is going to go up. The way you're going to do this is you're going to look at every one of these resources in order, and you're going to notice there's a picture of either a surplus worker or of a rebel. If your surplus resources happens to reach the level where it's going to say you're going to modify that track, that's exactly what you're going to do. For example, if you have enough fish on the domestic market to fill it up to the point where it's going to tell you to add onto your surplus workers, you're going to move the surplus worker the amount of spaces it tells you. So we have it at here where it says we're going to add +1 to the surplus workers. So we're going to add +1 to our surplus workers. And if we happen to have enough wood to say to fill up all the way down to this point, we're going to actually add 1 to our rebel track. And again, it has to be filled up left to right, top to bottom. But if we happen to have that many resources, we're going to adjust the track. So if we happen to be here on the wood track, we'd gain 1 rebel. If the iron happened to be filled up all the way down to here, we'd possibly fill it with 1 more surplus worker. We're going to do that with the domestic board, then we're going to do that with the export board, and then we're going to move over here to the third board, which is our colonist and the rebellion track. The position of our colonist is going to adjust whether we're going to move up the rebellion track or the surplus worker track. The rebel track itself is never going to be judged by these positionings. Only the colonist track is going to do that. If we happen to have our colonist track all the way down to 36 colonists, happen to be on the archipelago, we'd see that we'd add 1 to the rebellion track and we'd add 1 to the surplus workers track. Then finally we're going to move down to the fourth board, and depending on where this gray meeple is, we're going to adjust the rebellion track possibly. If it's on 1 to 3, we're going to -1 to the rebellion track, whereas if we're all the way down to 25 and 26, you're going to see we're going to add 5 to the rebellion track. Once we've gone through all 4 of these boards, adjusting the positions of the rebels and the surplus workers, phase 3 is over, and we now move to the crisis phase. The crisis phase, which is the 4th phase, is potentially the most confusing thing to learn the first couple times you're learning how to play Archipelago. Now the crisis phase is going to be based on the crisis card that is currently the top crisis card in the box displayed right here. Now again, I don't have enough room on camera for the box, so I'm going to pull these cards out of the box just to show you how this works. But you always leave these cards in the box so you have no idea what cards happen to be coming up. And to explain this concept a little bit better, I'm actually going to add some more workers to the board. I'm also going to add an extra player to the board. So this is going to make much more sense when I explain exactly how the crises work in phase 4. But before I do that, I want to let you know in the first turn, you bypass phase 4 just like you bypass phase 1. In the very first turn of the game, phase 1 and phase 4 do not happen. You notice that each crisis card is split exactly in half. You have a top half and a bottom half for every single crisis card, which also happens to correlate with your domestic board and your export board. The top half of every single crisis card is going to deal with your domestic board, and the bottom half of every single crisis card is going to deal with your export board. So don't ever forget, top half deals with your domestic, bottom half is going to deal with your export board. And during phase 4, we want to ignore any red crisis card. We're only going to deal with tan crisis or the off-white, which is called an event crisis. So if you ever see a red crisis happens to be on the top, we're not going to have that happen during phase 4. So this happened to be our top card right here. And we're in phase 4, and the top half for domestic board is red. That means this turn there will not be a domestic crisis, but there will be an export crisis because the bottom half happens to be tan. Whereas opposed, if this happened to be our top card, we would have a domestic crisis, but since the bottom half is red, we will not have an export crisis. Or if we happen to have this card as our top crisis card, we're going to have a domestic crisis, and we're also going to have an export crisis. And the crisis is the one that's going to be extremely important to try to be the first player, because the first player has the highest opportunity or the best possibility to survive any crisis because they can use the domestic or the export board to help back them up. The way a crisis is going to work is you're going to figure out what kind of crisis you're dealing with. First, we're going to deal with the domestic crisis, then we're going to deal with the export crisis first. The first thing we need to do is every single player needs to lay down every single meeple they have, because every single meeple is going to become a rebel. Now, before I go any further, I need to specify that ships are never laid on their side for any reason ever, because ships can never become rebels. Only your citizens can become rebels, so only your meeples are going to be put on their side. Ships are never going to be laid on their side because ships can never rebel, and ships can never go into rebellion or add to your rebellion track. Once all the meeples have been laid down, the first player, and starting with the first player, gets the opportunity to get some of these meeples out of rebellion. And the way this is going to work is you need to spend the amount of resources listed on the top half to stand up that many meeples. So for example, this one says for every wood resource you spend, you get to stand up 6 meeples. This one says for every fish resource you spend, you get to stand up 5 meeples. This one here says for every iron resource you spend, you get to stand up 6 meeples. The trick is you have to stand up exactly as many meeples as it shows, or all the remaining meeples. You can't spend 1 wood and then only stand up 3 or 4 meeples. You have to stand up as many meeples as the number listed. The advantage to being the first player, though, is that you can take these these resources from the domestic board if they happen to be available. If they're not available, these resources have to come out of your personal supply. And if you don't have them in your personal supply, you're at the mercy of other players who possibly have those resources, or you're going to be stuck with a whole bunch of citizens in rebellion who are going to do you absolutely no good when we enter the 5th phase. So, starting with the first player, the red player happens to be player number 1. They are suffering a domestic crisis of wood, so they can take 1 wood off the domestic board, or they can spend one of their own personal wood resources, which is not recommended because those can be used towards victory conditions or towards purchases. So obviously you want to abuse the domestic board as much as you can. In this example, we happen to have 1 wood on the domestic board, so red player as the first player gets the decision to spend this 1 resource, which is going to be returned to the bank, and then they have to stand up 6 meeples, or all the meeples left over, which happens to be greater. So this is where the negotiation comes in hand, and this is where a lot of players are going to start doing some very heavy negotiation. Since red spent 1 wood resource, they have to stand up 6 meeples. Well, obviously they're going to stand up their 4 meeples because they don't want their meeples in rebellion, because if they're in rebellion, they can't use them to work during the 5th phase. The trick is we have to stand up 2 more meeples, because remember, for the wood, we stand up a total of 6. So this is where blue and green are going to start negotiation with red to see if they can convince red to stand up some of their meeples. So the results of these negotiations are going to cause red to stand up 2 more meeples. Let's say blue and green happen to pay him a couple gold apiece, so they now stand up 1 meeple apiece. We still have some more meeples in rebellion, and red now has the opportunity to spend another wood resource off the domestic board if there happens to be one, or if they happen to have their own wood resource behind the board, they can do that. Or if they happen to have an explorer token, they can take this explorer token and trade it in for whatever resource they happen to want to use, and they can use it for this instance. The trick here is all explorer tokens, when they're traded in, they're not added back into the stacks. When these are traded in, they're actually removed from the game. They are not used anymore, so the stacks will still empty. So red has the opportunity, if they want, to turn their explorer token to get 1 wood if they like. And if they want, they can basically negotiate with these other players and say, hey, I'll spend this wood on you guys to stand up your guys if you want me to, but you're going to pay me, and you're going to pay me a lot. And again, that's all going to be based on the negotiations. But let's say red didn't want to do that. Red wanted to keep their explorer token, and red didn't have any wood they wanted to spend. It now moves up to blue to see if they can spend any resources to get their own guys to stand up. Let's say the domestic board has no more wood on it, so obviously they can't take the wood off the domestic board. And let's say blue doesn't happen to have any wood behind their board, and blue doesn't happen to have any explorer tokens. So blue cannot stand up any of their guys at all, and their guys that are still down are going to stay in rebellion. And then it would come up to the final player, which would be the green player, and they have the opportunity to spend 1 wood to try to save 6 of the workers. Now, if green happen to have an explorer token to turn in for a wood, or if they just happen to have a wood resource to turn in, they could turn in that wood resource, and they can stand up exactly 6 meeples of their choice. So what they'd have to do is, obviously, they'd start with their meeples. But since you're required to stand up a total of 6 meeples for 1 wood turned in, they would have to stand up any remaining down meeples until they reach a total of 6. So even though blue didn't have any wood to save their skin in this instance, since green happened to have wood and happened to spend it, blue happen to get saved from the repercussions of the domestic crisis. Now let's say in our example that green also didn't happen to have any wood or any explorer token to spend to start standing up any of their guys. Blue couldn't come back and say, oh wait, you know what, I have an explorer token, I want to spend it. It's too late. Once they've made the decision in the past, they're out of luck. They are basically going to have all these blue guys who are still in rebellion, and green is also going to have some guys in rebellion because green doesn't have the resources to pay to survive the crisis on the domestic market. After you've handled the domestic crisis, any meeple who is still laying down is going to be considered a rebel for this turn. Again, they're going to be stood up at the beginning of the next round in phase 1, but for this turn and this turn only, they're going to be rebels. So for every rebel on the board, you're going to advance the rebellion track by 1. So in this example, we happen to have 6 meeples who are laying down in rebellion. So if our rebel track happens to be at 6, we're going to add 6 more to our rebellion track, putting us at 12 rebels. And in this example, we happen to have 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We actually only have 12 citizens on the board. If the rebellion track goes up 1 more point, all of our players have lost the game. And we still have 1 more crisis to resolve. Now we need to resolve the crisis that happens to be on the export board. And starting in player order, players have the opportunity to discard as many resources that are listed on the export crisis to try to meet the requirement. They can take them off the export board if there happens to be any materials or resources on the export board, or they can take them out of their own personal supply. Any resource deficit not met is going to add 1 more to the rebellion board also. So if our players in this example as a group do not manage to discard a total of 3 fruit resources, we're going to get at least 1 more rebel, and the players are going to lose the game at this point. So as a group, starting with the red player, they need to decide if they have any explorer tokens they can turn in for fruit, or if they happen to have any fruit resources they hand in and discard in an effort to survive this crisis. Now, if the players as a group manage to get a total of 3 resources, handle it in, they're going to manage to survive this crisis. These 3 resources are going to be discarded back to the bank, and this crisis is going to be averted, and the player is going to be able to move on to phase number 5. Of course, don't forget that if you ever have a crisis that happens to be in red, it's not going to happen for this phase. And also, the other thing we have to pay attention to is we have to pay attention to any events that may happen instead of an actual crisis. So, for example, with this crisis card, we'd have fish as a requirement, which would actually be pretty easy because you see we actually have 5 fish on the board. So all the players could have easily discarded the amount of fish they needed to stood up all of their meeples at this chance. And then we're going to have an event which is going to lower the amount of rebellion by 2 based on the amount of churches in the game. So the players just happen to do some future planning, and they happen to have 2 churches on the archipelago. Since we have 2 churches, we're going to lower the rebellion. 2 times 2 is 4. We're going to go down from 12 back to 8 on the rebellion track in this example. Once the crisis phase 4 is done, we actually move on to phase 5, which is the action phase, which deals with the action wheel and where the players start interacting with the game. Now, before I move on to explain phase 5, I do want to explain one little thing about events. This is one of the ambiguities in the rule book, and I've never been able to find a definite answer to my question here. So this is a way that we have always played it. I'm willing to wait for somebody to correct me if I'm always wrong here. But the way we have always played it, because the rule book is never specific, is that these churches have to actually be controlled for them to affect the rebellion track. So in our example here, if this church was uncontrolled, which means there wasn't a meeple standing up in that church, it would not reduce the rebellion track. If it was controlled, it would. If it isn't controlled, it would not. So we have to have these churches actually controlled to affect the rebellion track during this event. Again, the rulebook's kind of ambiguous, and I'm going to get into that when I give you my final thoughts and review on the game about some of the ambiguities in the rulebook. But just to let you know, as far as we can tell, that's the spirit of the rules, that these churches and these buildings for these events have to actually be controlled for them to have effect on the crisis itself. The challenge with the crisis step itself, though, that you have to be very, very careful with when you're playing this game is that the crisis is not going to be discarded when it's resolved. If this crisis card happens to be at the top of the deck, every time you come back to the crisis phase, You're going to have to experience this crisis every time. It's not discarded after it's used. Matter of fact, a crisis deck is never going to shuffle unless there's an opening on the evolution track. So don't make that mistake. Once you deal with a crisis, again, it's not discarded. It's always going to stay the top crisis unless there happens to be an opening on the evolution track, which is going to cause this card to be added to the evolution track, opening up the next card in order to be the next crisis the players have to experience. And also, don't forget, when you go into Phase 5, any one of your meeples that happen to be in Rebellion cannot be used for any actions during Phase 5 at all. You might as well just pretend you don't even own those meeples, because they will not be able to be used for any actions for your player during your turn until they reset at the Phase 1 again. Moving on to Phase 5. Phase 5 is where the players are going to get the main interaction, like I said, with the game, and it's going to be using the action wheel. Now, this action wheel is two-sided, and now the reason why it's double-sided is because there's the 5-player side and there's the 2 to 4 player side. The way to tell the difference is the 5-player side has a spot for the purple player, and the 2 to 4 player side does not. So if you're playing 2 to 4 players, purple is out of the question unless you want to pretend that purple gets used one of the other players' location colors. You're going to notice some of these locations have a specific color, and that means only that player can use that circle, that location, to play their action disc. Whereas opposed, you see these little circles that have a rainbow of colors that can be used by the first player to use that location on a first come, first served basis. The trick is that on these locations that have the rainbow color, if it's in a section where you actually have a color of your own, you have to actually use your own color first before you can use the rainbow colored sections, which prevents you from blocking out by grabbing the 2 rainbow colored and locking the other players out. Again, when you use one of these locations, you have to use your matching color first before you can access the rainbow colors to prevent you from blocking them out from the other players. And since I'm showing you how to play with a 3-player game here, we're going to stick with the 2 to 4 player side of the action disc, and the action disc is going to basically be where you do all your actions. On your round, you're going to get to do one action on the action disc, and you're basically going to take one of your action discs, put it in one of these locations, you're going to perform that action. And then after you place your action disc, you can play one evolution card if you happen to have it. Now you have to actually control the evolution card to use it, unless it's a special kind of evolution card. And I'll get to that in just a few moments when I get to Phase 6. You can also do one visit to the marketplace or one visit to the port, but you have to actually own a marketplace and or a port to use those locations. Don't get confused though, because on your round you can actually play an evolution card, which requires you place one of your action discs on that evolution card. That doesn't prevent you from also placing an action disc on the action board. Again, on your turn, you can play one action disc on the action board. You can make one visit either to the marketplace or to the port, but again, you have to actually control one of those to use it, and you can interact with one of your evolution cards. Even if that evolution card requires you to place an action disc on it to use it, you can do all those things on your round. Just go over the actions really quick that you can do on your turn. On your turn, you can do an explore action. To do an explore action, you place your action disc down, saying that you're going to perform that action, and then you're going to go through the routine as we showed in the beginning of the game, where you're going to draw either the top region tile, and if you don't like the top region tile, without peeking, you can decide that you don't want the top one and you take the one underneath it. You have to take that one below it though if you choose to bypass the top one. Again, you have to do that without peeking. So if you decide to do an explore action, you decide if you want the top one without flipping it over to look at the back side. If you take the top one, you have to add it to the board in a legal way. If you're unable to add it to the board in a legal way, you have lost your explore action. So that's kind of the risk you take when you do the explore action. You have to be able to place the tile that you selected legally, and if you're unable to place the tile you selected legally, again, you have lost your explore action. You can't add that tile to the board, but luckily you have both sides to access to decide which one of these sides can possibly fit. When you do the explore action though, you have to do an explore action next to a region tile where you currently have an active unit able to move to the location you're trying to explore to. So, for example, if I was the blue player and I just did the explore action, and I decided to pick this tile, I could not place this tile right here at this location because Units in rebellion do not do any work for you. You cannot use them at all, so I cannot use either of these units, these explorers, these citizens, to move into this tile. I could place this tile right here, like this though, which is a legal placement for the tile, and since this unit is not tied up doing anything else, I can use him for my exploration. I move him into the tile to show that he's explored the action, and then I'm going to go through the process of getting my explorer token, get the possible resources, count up the amount of huts, and I'm going to adjust the amount of available surplus workers based on however many huts happen to be on that tile, just like we did again in turn number 0. The next action you can do on your turn is the action of taxation. Now you notice that there's only 3 spots on the taxation action, and it's basically a first come first serve because they're the rainbow colored. So you're basically going to use these when you can, and once all 3 of those locations are tied up, no other player can use the taxation action anymore during this turn. As soon as you use the taxation action, you're going to gain the amount of money based on how many active units you have currently in the archipelago. Ships count as units, so you're going to get 1 for each ship, 1 for each one of your citizens you have. You're going to get 2 for each town you control, and you get 2 for each church you control. The trick is, whenever you do taxation though, the rebellion level is going to go up by 1 point every time taxation is used. So if 3 players happen to use taxation on a round, or on a turn, the taxation level is going to cause rebellion to go up by 3 levels, possibly bringing about the end of the game. So you have to be very careful about taxation. The next action you can do, or the next potential action you can do on your turn, is you can do a harvest action. Now the harvest actions are all unlimited. As many people can do the harvest action as they want, as they have available action discs to do. The trick is, when you're harvesting, you're basically going to pick a resource, and all your meeples who have access to that resource on region tiles they currently occupy are going to go ahead and start going out and gathering that resource. So for example, our green player, if they wanted to go ahead and harvest cattle, we're going to look at all the region tiles that we happen to have a green meeple on. Now boats can't harvest cattle because boats can't go on land, so only our citizens can do that. And we're going to pick any citizen who's not currently in rebellion, and we're going to allow them to go after that resource, and we're going to gain that resource as many times as we have meeples available to do it. If green happen to have no units currently in rebellion, and they currently had their units spread out just like this, we're going to see that we have access to 1, 2, 3 cows, and we actually have citizens who aren't in rebellion. We can actually move all 3 of our citizens onto those resources for 1 harvest action, and we end up getting 3 meat resources that we get to add behind our shield for 1 harvest action. But if we happen to have a couple of our units who happen to be in rebellion, we cannot again use them for the harvest action, so we'd end up getting less resources. Of course, you don't have to send all your units out to harvest, especially if you want to use that citizen for a different action later on during the turn, because unfortunately, once they're tied up harvesting, they're pretty much tied up for the rest of the round, and the other remaining actions that meeple can do for the rest of the turn become restricted. Basically, once a meeple or a unit is engaged in any kind of action that requires them to become engaged, they cannot do any other actions that requires them to be unengaged to perform. So harvesting requires you to be unengaged, and if you're unengaged, you can engage in harvesting. Building a building requires you to be unengaged, but once you build a building, you become engaged and permanently locked into building that building for the rest of the turn. That meeple becomes unavailable for any other actions that require him to be engaged. So you need to judge your actions carefully, because your meeples can't do everything every single turn. They can only do a certain amount of actions before they're tied up for the rest of the turn. Players on their turn can also decide that they do construction. Construction is an unlimited action. You can do as many times on a turn as you can pay the resources for. And you simply need to pick a meeple who is currently unengaged. They become engaged in the action of building whatever you decide for them to build. You pay the resources, and then they can immediately use that location for any of its benefits once it's built, even on the same turn you built it. So if we happen to build a port, and it happens to be our very first port we built this turn, we can use it immediately, spend $1 and immediately go to port and use the advantages of owning a port on that turn, even though we just built it before another player even gets a chance to perform one of their actions. Players on their turn can also interact with the marketplace. If they decide to interact with the marketplace, they can buy and sell one resource and one resource only. Now, it's not one type of resource, it's one resource cube only. If they decide to sell to the market, they can either sell to the domestic or the export market, depending on which one's going to give them the most revenue. And there's different values depending on how full these marketplaces are. The more full they become, the less value each one of those resources are worth to you. But the less full they are, generally the more valuable those resources can be to buy and sell. And the prices are basically listed right on the board themselves. If we want to interact with the domestic board and we happen to have currently 3 pieces of cattle currently on the domestic board, if we wanted to sell one meat to the domestic board, it'd be worth $5 to us. If we wanted to buy one meat from the domestic board, it's going to cost us $5. If we wanted to sell one meat to the export board, it would give us $5. If we wanted to buy it from the export board, it's going to cost us $5. These costs can vary anywhere from 4 to 1 all the way up to 8 and anywhere in between. So you need to make sure you play the market and do it as most advantageously to you at the time. The next action players can do is they can recruit from the surplus worker board based on the current amount of surplus workers are currently available. Now, the cost of these surplus workers is going to be based on exactly how many surplus workers are available. The more they're available, the cheaper they are to become. If you have 26 workers, they're going to cost $1 a piece, all the way down to if you only have 1, 2, or 3 available, they're going to cost you $4 a piece. For one recruitment action, you can buy as many as you can afford, but you need to make sure that you're buying them one at a time so you pay the correct cost. So there's currently 8 in the surplus market. Your first one's going to cost you 3 to buy. Your second one would cost you 3. But if there's actually only 4 of them currently left in the surplus market board, your first one would cost 3 to buy. Your second one is going to cost you 4 to buy. Your third one would also cost you 4 to buy. You can buy as many as you want as long as you have the money and you respect the limits for each region tile. Now remember, each region tile can never have more than 3 meeples of your color on a region tile. So if the blue player decided to do some recruitment, they could technically buy all the way up to 4 total people from the surplus board as long as they had the money for it and as long as they added these recruited guys to tiles where they currently already have a worker. The trick is, though, remember, anybody in rebellion you cannot use at all. So even though we have 2 workers currently on this region tile, since they're both in rebellion, they can't be used to go out recruiting. So we couldn't buy this worker and add him to the board. We could only buy and recruit at locations where we currently have active citizens who are not in rebellion. The next possible action you can do is reproduce, which is allow you to add workers to a region tile without having to pay a cost, but there's a certain amount of requirements for it. First of all, you can only do the reproduce action once per turn, and you place your action disc on the location on your own color, and there's enough spots for every player to do it only one time. And then you're going to pick a region where you currently have 2 and has to be exactly 2 workers who are not in rebellion currently on that location. If you have any region tile that has exactly 2 workers on it, you're simply going to add a 3rd worker to that region tile without having to pay any costs. But again, you can only do this once, and you have to have 2 workers currently on this tile. In this example, this region tile we could reproduce on, but these 2 region tiles red could not reproduce on because on each region tile they currently only have 1 citizen apiece. The final action you do on the action disc is the action of migration, which is basically just a fancy way of saying movement for all your active units that you control. Now for migration, what you can do is you move each one of your active units 1 hex tile only, and on top of that you can actually use your boats to move them across sea spaces by a sea convoy. Basically what you're going to do is you can move any one of your units 1 space as long as they're active and they're not currently engaged in other action. So since this meeple right here decided to build this town on this turn, he's currently engaged in building this town, so he cannot migrate at all. This guy is in rebellion, so he cannot activate at all. This guy right here, since he was building a port, he can't migrate at all. So only options we would have is we could move with our ships. They can move 1 space. But if we happen to have units who weren't tied up on doing things, we can actually use a boat to go from 1 region tile to connected region tile as long as there's a boat to use to get across between those two region tiles. And we can actually use that to get across multiple region tiles as long as we have boats set up properly to move us across multiple region tiles. Additionally, using a boat, as long as that boat starting that region tile doesn't actually use the movement for that boat to do that sea convoy for that citizen. If I wanted to move this citizen from here to this region tile, I could do so using this boat right here, and then afterwards I can move this boat because it didn't use its movement to create the sea convoy. Earlier in the video I told you about controlled and uncontrolled buildings, and you're probably wondering what is the point of building buildings. Buildings are going to give you a very good leg up in this game, and on top of that they're also going to be, as you already know, they're possibly going to help you win the game, get extra winning conditions, or score extra victory points, or possibly bring them out at the end of the game, because buildings can be part of those victory and end game conditions. There are 4 kinds of buildings in Archipelago, and they all have different benefits, but remember, you never ever get the benefit of a building unless you control the building itself. And the way to control a building is you have to have an active unit in the building, and an active unit is any unit who is not currently in rebellion. Now there's 4 different kinds of buildings. There's a town, there's a marketplace, there's a port, and there's also the church. Now the port can be used by a citizen, and a port can also be used by a ship. You can park a ship in a port, and you can use the effects of that port. As long as you park that ship there, you never have to move it off. And as long as you have that ship there, you can use that port once per turn. Every port you control, you can use once per turn. If you have 3 ports, that means you can use 3 port actions on one round. On one turn. You can use 1 port per round, a total of all 3 during the entire phase 5 action turn. Now you may be wondering what benefits you're going to get from owning these buildings. Well, if you control a port, remember when I showed you the transaction phase, where if you do the transaction action, you can buy or sell 1 item from either the domestic board or from the export board. Well, if you happen to have a port and you control that port, you don't have to use an action disc to use that port. You simply spend $1 on the port of your color, green, blue, red, and yellow in the 4-player game. If the green player decides to use the port they own, they're going to spend $1, and again, it's not going to be one of their action discs, so they can use their action discs for other purposes, and they can make 2 transactions from the export board from the port. If they happen to have control of the marketplace, they can do 2 transactions from the domestic market board. That means you do 1 buy, 1 sell, 2 sales, 2 buys. It doesn't matter as long as you control the marketplace for the domestic board or control the port for the export board. Very, very powerful, again, because it doesn't use an action disc, and it allows you to do 2 transactions instead of just 1 transaction. The churches are going to be very nice because anytime you control a church, any unit who's currently in the church can never go into rebellion. And not only that, but if you happen to have a unit in a church, you can also prevent any other current units, or I should say citizens, because ships never go into rebellion. Remember, ships never rebel, only your citizens do. Any citizens that happen to be on the same region tile as a unit who controls a church can also avoid going into rebellion if the person who controls the church chooses to. And yes, you guessed it, this is another fantastic opportunity for negotiation. If green happens to control this church in this region tile, and there happens to be 2 blue citizens here, and there also happens to be 1 red citizen here, during the crisis, when you lay down all the citizens across the entire archipelago, since green controls this church, he can look at the red player and he can look at the blue player and say, how much is it worth it for you to pay me to make it so these guys don't go into rebellion with the rest of those guys? And if green doesn't like the offers he gets, he can decide who among them goes into rebellion and who doesn't. Let's say red pays green what he wants and blue doesn't. Green can decide that this rebel unit is not going to be laid down during the crisis, but these 2 blue guys are, because they didn't like the negotiations that blue happened to do with green. Again, very strong negotiations in Archipelago, very cutthroat at times, and in my opinion, very fun. And now we get to the towns. Now the towns can be potentially the most confusing thing, but they're also the most powerful thing when it comes to a region tile. If you happen to control a town, you basically control that entire region tile, and you get to make all the decisions for that region tile itself. What that means is that no player can ever harvest on a tile that you control the town for without your permission. Again, a little negotiation never hurt in this aspect. If you want to do some harvesting on a tile that another player controls through the town, you better be willing to pay that player what they ask for if you want to harvest really badly there. On top of that, if you happen to control the town, you also happen to control any other building on that same region tile that is currently unoccupied, and no other player can enter those buildings as long as you control the town. The moment you lose control of that town because your guy who controls the town goes in rebellion, these other buildings become fair game for those players to enter, and you can't kick them out of those buildings unless they happen to go into rebellion too, and you happen to get out of rebellion. As soon as that happens, you can kick that rebel scum out of the building because you control the town. The additional really nice benefit of controlling a town is if you control a town, you also happen to control all the buildings on that region tile without having to actually park one of your units inside that building. So if Green happened to control this town, he also controls this port, he controls this marketplace, and he controls this church, and he can use all their abilities anytime he wants because he controls all of them because he controls the town. You do have to be really careful here though, because during a crisis, remember during a crisis, all units across the entire archipelago are going to be laid down before you decide to resolve the crisis. So if this guy happens to lay down during the crisis, since he's laying down in the town, he no longer controls the town, which means he no longer controls the church, which means he can no longer force the negotiations and use the power of the church. So you want to be careful about your negotiations about leaving those churches empty all the time, especially if you expect a bad crisis card to come up and start hampering your plans. So in those cases, it's always nice to have one of your meeples in a town and also have one of your meeples inside the church. That way when the crisis comes up, you can decide that your two green meeples, the one in the church and the one in the town, don't fall down. Everybody else falls down and you still have control of all the buildings on that region tile. There's one other point to make about buildings. All the buildings are unique per region tile, which means you only have one town tile per region, one port per region, one marketplace per region, and one church per region. Also be careful with ports. Ports have to actually be built along a body of water. Again, this game emphasizes proper, realistic building. This port right here, if you happen to have a tile which happens to have no water on it, such as this, you can never build a port on this tile. And also, as with all the other resources in the game of Archipelago, all resources that come in the game, all playing pieces are limited to what comes in the box. So it's highly possible, especially in a 5-player game, for there not to be any ports available for your build because there's none left in the box. As I said, Phase 5 is the main action for the game, and you got to see a lot of possibility for action during Phase 5. Now that you've seen exactly how Phase 5 works, it's now to see how the final phase of the game works. Phase 6, which is the last phase of each round, which is the most interesting part, which happens to be the evolution cards and the evolution track. Now the evolution track is basically Phase 6 of the game. And the first thing you're going to do at the start of Phase 6 is all players are going to remove all their action discs from the action board. They're going to get their action discs back to use on the next turn of the game. Now I'm not going to go over every single one of these cards because this video is starting to get long, and I basically want to give you how to play the game, especially since a lot of these cards you can just read and figure out exactly how they work. And if you have any questions, a lot of these cards are explained a little bit better in the rule book. Not all of them are, but a good decent majority of them, at least to help you understand exactly how these evolution cards work. Now remember earlier I said there's two kinds of evolution cards. There's progress cards and there's person or character cards. Those are the two kinds of evolution cards in the game. You have your character cards, which again have the black numbering in the lower left, and you have your progress evolution cards, which are the white numbering in the lower left. The only time that does matter is exactly for the scoring and for the end game conditions. But again, I want to remind you of that does exist, so you don't forget. It's very important. During the evolution phase, players in player order are going to do one of two actions, and they have to do these actions in this exact order. It's very, very important that you follow this exact order every time you do it. You can either buy an evolution card and then rotate an evolution card, or you can rotate 2 different evolution cards. Now, why would you want to rotate an evolution card? Well, if you look at every single evolution card, they're going to have a cost next to one of these arrows, and that's going to tell you the current cost for that evolution card. But these cards are going to be rotated by the players, and these rotations are going to change exactly how much these cards are going to cost. The cost can sometimes go up, and sometimes the cost can go down. The trick is, if a card gets rotated 3 times, it's going to end up being rotated to the skull. As soon as you get to that skull, that card is removed from that evolution track and is basically gone from the game, because you're never going to go through all these evolution cards, and it's going to be replaced with the next card in the crisis stack, which is going to become the new evolution card. They're going to take the place of that evolution card. Also, as soon as you buy that card and you pay the cost listed currently next to this arrow, that tells you the current cost. So right now, with the turn right now, this Pope card costs 10. If it happens to get turned again, it's going to cost 12 to buy. If it gets turned again, it's going to be removed from the evolution track, and it's going to be replaced. So again, for phase 6, you're going to do the 2 actions. You're going to buy and then rotate an evolution card, or you're going to pick 2 evolution cards and you're going to rotate them. If you decide to buy an evolution card, you're going to buy it, you're going to add it to your available abilities, and you have to be careful, because some of these evolution cards, not to get ahead of myself, are actually usable by other players. I'll get to that in just a moment. I want to explain the evolution track first, though. After you buy an evolution card and then rotate another card in that order, you're going to draw the next card from the top of the crisis deck. Now, if you happen to buy a card and then you happen to rotate another card that's going to remove it down to the skull, it's also going to be removed from the game, and then you're going to fill these cards up one at a time and replace them on the evolution track. Now, the important reason why you want to do these one at a time is because anytime if you happen to draw the top card of the crisis deck and the next card you draw happens to be a red crisis card, you need to resolve that crisis immediately, the same way you would have resolved it if it happened to be a tan card during the phase 4 that I showed you earlier during the tutorial. After you resolve the crisis, if there's still an opening, you're going to flip a card and you're going to fill it up, and you're going to continue filling the crisis or the evolution track as you would normally. Now, the trick is here, you have to be very, very careful with this, though, because if, for example, you happen to have a situation where you have 2 openings on the evolution track here, and if you were to draw the top crisis card to add to the evolution track, you'd see that you have a red crisis. You need to resolve this red crisis, and then you need to fill up the spot still. And you might end up having a second red crisis. So you have to be very careful about making sure you follow those instructions in that exact order, because it is possible to have 2 crises in a row. Now again, you're only going to resolve these if you get a red crisis. If you happen to see a tan crisis card, nothing's going to happen. If you have an opening in the evolution track, you're simply going to fill it up. But if you reveal a red, you're going to handle that crisis immediately. As soon as you buy an evolution card, you're going to add it basically to your side of your little section on the board next to your screen here, where you're keeping your resources hidden from other players. But these cards, these evolution cards, you have to leave them out so the other players can see what other evolution cards have been purchased, for 2 reasons. 1, players need to be tracking the end game condition, and 2, some of these evolution cards are going to have an arrow on them that's going to be a rainbow color. If you ever see a rainbow color evolution card, that means any player can use that evolution card. Now, even though I purchased this evolution card, any player can use this in the first come, first serve, and all these evolution cards have this arrow. That arrows remind you that they're only usable once per turn. As soon as the evolution card is used, it's going to be turned sideways, and it's not going to refresh until the phase 1 of the following turn, when all cards and all units get the potential to refresh. Now, you may be saying to yourself, why do I want to buy a card if another player can possibly use it? Well, there's 2 answers for that. Not all cards are going to have this rainbow arrow on them. If it happens to be just a gray arrow, that means only the person who owns that card can use it. But it has to be a gray arrow. If it happens to be that rainbow arrow, that means any player can use that card just by spending and using that card. And I should have been more prepared here. Sorry. Here we go. Here's a gray one right here. Gray arrow means only the person who controls that card can use it. But if you happen to have one with a rainbow arrow, and let's say I happen to control this card right here with a rainbow arrow, it basically says whoever uses it pays $1, turns the card sideways, and that card is used up. If I own this card and I use it, I'm going to pay that $1 to the bank. If I own this card and somebody else uses it, they have to pay that $1 to me, and on top of that, they have to pay an additional dollar because they're using a card that I own. So this card happens to cost $4 to use. They have to pay me $5 to use it, and that money comes directly to me. If this card costs $4 to use and I control it and I use it, I pay that $4 to the bank. That's why it's nice to sometimes have these cards out, because other players are going to pay you to use your evolution cards. There's one final evolution card that's going to be kind of important for me to explain to you, and these are going to be the most important thing that's going to be a little bit different from everything else. These evolution cards are going to be wonder cards, such as the Cathedral. Now, the nice thing about these wonder cards is they're basically one-time use. After you buy the wonder, you basically have to pay resources to complete that wonder, and it's going to be worth victory points at the end of the game, and sometimes they'll give you an effect immediately when it's built. For example, this one's going to lower the rebellion track based on however many churches are currently out there on the archipelago. Basically, what you're going to do is, to build this one, you're going to spend 2 action discs, 3 resources, and you currently have to have a church already you control on the board. If you control a church, you can build the cathedral. Here's the trick, though. As soon as you build that cathedral, you're permanently going to sacrifice one of your citizens to that card for the rest of the game. This guy is never going to come off this card. He's going to be stuck there for the rest of the game, permanently lowering your max citizens you have available for you for the rest of the game. Now, every player has a maximum of 10 citizens available to the game. So while building the wonders can give you a lot of victory points at the end of the game, you have to decide if it's worth the risk to build multiple wonders to permanently sacrifice these workers that you'll never have access to for the rest of the game. And also, do note that you can never, ever use any of these evolution cards during any time in the game except for Phase 5 of the game. And now remember, during Phase 5, you can spend 1 action disc on the action wheel. You can use 1 evolution card per round. And you can also use 1 port or 1 marketplace on every one of your rounds during the Phase 5. So you can't buy one of these evolution cards during Phase 6 and use it immediately. You have to wait until the following Phase 5 action round to use any one of these action cards after you purchase them. And again, most of these evolution cards are pretty self-explanatory. There's almost 50 of them that come with the base game, plus there's another 40 if you happen to get the expansion. So I'm definitely not going to go over all of them with you. They're mostly self-explanatory. The only thing you need to realize is that if it's a multicolored arrow, any player can use it, first come, first serve. All evolution cards are only usable once per turn, and they all have various costs, and some of them are going to give you a victory point if you happen to get them into play, and that's going to be represented by the medal on the evolution card. Cathedral and the Great Lighthouse are great wonders. You only get the victory points if you actually successfully build them. Buying them is not going to give you the victory points. You have to actually buy them and then build them to get the victory points. This is a lot to digest in one time. There's a lot to the game of Archipelago. It's not the most complex Euro game I've ever played or ever owned, but it's definitely one of the more challenging ones. This game is going to be played over the phases. You're going to keep going, keep going, keep going until somebody manages to reach one of the end game conditions. As soon as the end game condition is reached, all players are going to add up their scores based on the current hidden victory condition cards that are currently in play, plus the current trend card. Whoever has the most victory points is going to win. If there's a tie, the tiebreaker condition is whoever has the most money. And of course, if there's ever a revolution, all the players lose immediately unless one of the players happens to be the separatist, and the separatist alone is the grand winner of Archipelago. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial video for Archipelago, showing you exactly how to play Archipelago, the game. If you have any questions, please leave them in the YouTube comments down below. I hope I explained everything clearly. Again, if you have any questions, leave them below. I'll gladly answer any of those questions. I'm going to go ahead and clean everything up and start the sample gameplay video, which is going to tie everything together, and it's probably going to help you make a lot more sense out of all these actions in this very deep game of Archipelago.